श्री स्वामीनारायण भगवान ની જય, અક્ષર પુરુષોત્તમ મહારાજની જય, પ્રમુખ સ્વામી મહારાજની જય, મહંત સ્વામી મહારાજની જય, પ્રમુખ સ્વામી મહારાજ શતાબ્દી મહોત્સવની જય. As we celebrate 100 years of Pramukh Swami Maharaj's birth anniversary, we're also studying the Pramukh Swami Maharaj Jivan Charitra. It gives us a good opportunity to take a dive into the life and work of Pramukh Swami Maharaj. For many of us who have witnessed Pramukh Swami Maharaj, this will be an incredible journey, not just to learn the greatness about Pramukh Swami Maharaj, but also to be able to relive and experience the moments that we've had with Pramukh Swami Maharaj. And so, as we move on week after week, we will be studying the life of Pramukh Swami Maharaj based on the Jivan Charitra that has been written by Puja Adarsh Jivan Swami, obviously a compilation of many other prasangs and incidences through Bapa's diary and other books that we've had and other interviews from different Hari Bhaktos. This week we're going to start with part 1 and we're going to look at pages 1 to 45. Many of us may have downloaded the document that is available on myBAPS, and it describes each different section, and it's very nicely done because then we can see not just the topic, not just the title of the chapter, but there's a brief description also about what the chapter covers, just a small summary. So as we begin this, let's just pray that we too can imbibe the virtues and the qualities that we saw in Pramukh Swami Maharaj and live a life accordingly. To start off with chapter 1, it starts off with a description of the village in which Puja Pramukh Swami Maharaj was born. Swami Shri was born in a village called Chansad, which is roughly 12 kilometers southwest of Vadodara. Many Hari Bhaktas have also been to this village, and we can see the image over here. There's a very nice image of the pond and the mandir, which reminds us a lot about Pramukh Swami Maharaj in his childhood days. A brief description of the village. Chansad is a village predominantly of farmers and farming, and we can see that the farmers would normally, the crop that grew over there was millet, like gaun, bajri, pachi juar, mug, and mut, and cotton. So these are the things that were farmed in the village of Chansad. Many Nanda Paramahansis has also been blessed the village of Chansad. Bhagwan Swaminarayan ઘણા બધા પરમહંસ હતા, એ લોકો પણ ચાણસદમાં પધારી ચૂકેલા હતા. If we look at the Guru Parampara, the village of Chansad was also blessed by the Gunatit Guru Parampara. Bhagatji Maharaj was there in 1888. He had visited there almost 32 different times. And we saw earlier in the slide before, there was a Hanuman Mandir, and Bhagatji Maharaj had done the pratishtha of the murti in that mandir. Many a time Pramukh Swami Maharaj had also visited that mandir even as a child. Brahmaswarup Shastriji Maharaj, just before he had left Vartal, a few months before he had left Vartal, he had also spent some time over there. In 1905, Shastriji Maharaj was suffering from mouth ulcers, and he was invited there by Mansukh-bhai Vaidya, who was going to treat him over there. So Shastriji Maharaj had stayed there for 1.5 months. Normally he would go there, he would go to Vartal for the Chaitri festival, but instead he chose to stay in Chansad. And Mansukh-bhai Vaidya, who was going to treat him over there, spent some time over there. And he had kept a very healthy cow specifically for Shastriji Maharaj. And so the treatment that was allowed, the treatment that was going to be given to Shastriji Maharaj was based on that fresh milk that would come from that cow, different kind of medication, some sugar cane, which Shastriji Maharaj was given twice a day. There were also some very senior Hari Bhaktas that we've heard of that would actually also come to meet Shastriji Maharaj. Gal Bhai, then Kalidas Bhai, Moti Bhagwan Das, all these senior Hari Bhaktas who were revered at that time were also part of that, would also go to Chansad and spend some time over there. So a brief description about some of that history over there. In fact, in 1926, Shastriji Maharaj had stayed there for approximately 1 month to do a parayan in Chansad. Now 1926, so Pramukh Swami Maharaj as a little child was probably in the village at that time. Then Yogiji Maharaj had also spent some time in Chansad, almost 1 year after he had arrived from Junagadh. And Yogi Bapa would often reminisce how his days in Chansad were, Yogi Baba ઘણી વાર એવું કહેતા કે અહીં એક વરસ લાગટ રહેલો. હું જ ગુરુ, હું જ શિષ્ય, હું રસોઈ કરું, હું વારું, બધું જ હું કરતો. 16-17 વર્ષની ઉંમર મારી તે વખતે હતી. બીજા બધા ઘરડા, હું જુવાન, પાવર બહુ, જોશ બહુ. કીર્તન બોલું તો નડિયા ગાજે. રણછોડ ભગત કહે કે જોજો નડિયા ના ઉડે. વાત કરું તો અડધા માઇલ સુધી સંભળાય. લાઉડ સ્પીકર તૂટી જાય. સવારે ઉઠી વંજારીએ કુએ નાય આવતા. સવારના 4 થી 5:30 સુધી ધીર ધુરંધરા એના પદ અમે બોલીએ. અખંડ કથા વાર્તા થતી. કોઈની ઉપાધિ નહીં. આખો દિવસ વાતો, વચનામૃત, 64 પદી શીખીએ. કીર્તન ગાતા થાકતા જ નહીં. Yogiji Maharaj reminisces and explains how that 1 year that he spent in Junagadh, maybe we could compare it to a lockdown. But what did he do? Yogi Baba would say that most of the sadhus that were with me at that time were of an elderly age. He goes, I was probably the youngest at that time, between the ages of 16 and 17. That's how old I was at that time. But he had so much energy, so much passion. Swami would go, I would sing kirtans, but I would sing kirtans so loud, it would actually, the roof tiles would vibrate. Ranchod Bhagat would say, be careful that the tiles don't fall. Swami said, Yogi Baba would say that I had such a loud voice back then that when I would sing, when I would do katha, you could hear me a half a mile away. Obviously, Yogi Baba was very engaged, and for those of us who've actually met Yogi Baba or have actually heard about Yogiji Maharaj, he was so engrossed in bhajan, katha, kirtan that his entire day he would spend. Lockdown ma su karvu. This is what Yogi Baba did. Yogi Baba says that there were no difficulties. All day we would study the Swamini Vato, the Vachnamrit, the Chorsat Padi. I would never get tired of singing bhajans. This is some of the history of the village in Chansad and the Guru Parampara in Chansad. The next chapter talks about Pramukh Swami Maharaj's family background. His father's name was Motibhai Prabhudas Patel. Motibhai was born in a Leva Patidar community, and he had come into contact with Shastriji Maharaj, and that's how he came into satsang. That's how he was introduced into the satsang. He was a very staunch devotee, and Shastriji Maharaj would spend a lot of time doing seva. Moti Bhagwan Das would spend a lot of time doing seva of Shastriji Maharaj at that time. His grandfather's name was Prabhudas Patel. They were 3 sons. So you could say that Pramukh Swami Maharaj had two kakas. Pramukh Swami Maharaj's mother's name was Diwaliba. Diwaliba was born in the village of Menpura, which is in the Vadodara district. Her parents' name was Shamalbhai and Jeetba Desai of Lachras. Now, an interesting fact over here, Desai family. They were from a Desai family, and these were the names of her parents. The family had come into association with Bhagaji Maharaj, and that's how they got involved in satsang. She had 3 other brothers. So Pramukh Swami Maharaj had 3 mamas. Just some interesting information over here. Both husband and wife, basically Pramukh Swami Maharaj's parents, were also very, very involved in seva. They were a very devout couple and very involved in seva. Diwaliba was also very much involved in the mandir seva. Every time, sometimes from Atladra, they would bring back wheat for grinding. So Diwaliba na ghare જ આ ઘઉં દળવાની સેવા એ પોતે કરતા. Also, sometimes she would take the animals from the mandir to graze in the farms in the fields over there. Also, she would offer her services in the foundations of the mandir. So when the mandir construction, when the mandir in Chansad was being built, she was very much involved in the seva at that time as well. She would help in the foundations, laying in the foundations. Also, during the construction of the mandir in Atladra, she was heavily involved in that seva. Basically, what would happen would be that a whole group of Hari Bhaktos would take a cartload of Hari Bhaktos from Chansad all the way to Atladra, and she was very much involved in that seva. But one other thing that she would do is she would prepare dhebra for all the Hari Bhaktos that were doing seva over there. So that was one of her sevas as well. As we carry on, a prasang about Moti Bhagwan Das, Motibhai Prabhudas Bhai Patel, that was the name of Pramukh Swami Maharaj's father. Once on one occasion, their grandson basically one of his daughter's son had become terminally ill. Everybody was very, very worried. But one thing that we noticed about Motibhai and the family was their faith in Bhagwan Swaminarayan was very, very strong and unflinching. And this carried them all the way through. So, in a matter of time, Motibhai took his grandson into his lap. He continued to do the Swaminarayan mantra, dhun karwa mandya. And thodik varni andar, people had thought that, the son had actually passed away. Luckily, the child survived. But again, another testimony of his faith. There was a time when Motibhai was actually traveling with Shastriji Maharaj. Badi gamni andar badi padramni karta ase. And that time they heard the news that the wall in the periphery of the tower of their house had actually collapsed. Normally, somebody would actually run quickly to go and repair that and fix everything. Motibhai was so, he had so much conviction with Shastriji Maharaj, ki alab leid levo che. And Shastriji Maharaj was the one that actually notified him, that Tamari diwal padi gayi che, don't you want to go home? And Motibhai then said, Swami, look, you're the one, that watches over my house and everything. Everything will be taken care of. So at that time, he made sure that he took care of that time. There was another time when Diwaliba was working in the fields and she got bitten by a snake. And when she got bitten by a snake, immediately at that time, everybody got together at the village and people wanted to do some household remedies. But Motibhai was, again, his faith in Bhagwan was so strong. He said, look, let's forget this conventional medication. Let's take her to the mandir. We'll do dhun. And a mandir ma lai gaya. They carried her to the ladies' mandir and they did dhun as well at that time. Luckily, fortunately for Diwaliba, she also recovered very quickly. The next chapter talks about Shantilal. Pramukh Swami Maharaj's childhood name was Shantilal. He was born in the village of Chansad on the auspicious day of Magshar Sud Atham, according to the Indian calendar, Vikram Samvat 1978, which is on a Wednesday on the 7th of December 1921. It's a very interesting fact again. He was born between 8 a.m. and 9 a.m. and he was named Shantilal. The next chapters will be talking about Pramukh Swami Maharaj's childhood personality and his nature. Shantilal was of a very, very sober, very calm nature, very, very quiet from the beginning. He was always very non-complaining. Koi des faryad karwani જ nahi. Je kai hoy, he would, tolerate everything as well. There was an occasion when Shantilal had a bout of chicken pox, and all the sores on his body were, profusely leaking and sticking to the clothes. But he wouldn't protest. He wouldn't make a fuss about it. Nothing like that. On one occasion, that's why probably the parents named him Shanti. Swabhav pan Shanta jato, and that's why he was named Shantilal. In every action, he spoke very quietly. He was very mellow, very soft-spoken, a very pleasant personality, very non-complaining. There was an occasion when he had intense diarrhea at that time. And so what had happened was he went to the nearby lake, because normally what would happen was as soon as you have to go to the toilet, you have to go and take a bath. And so Shantilal would regularly have to go to the toilet, go for a bath, go to the toilet, go for a bath. He became so weak that he ended up just sitting nearby the tree, and he just was lying over there. Then a group of his friends then actually eventually carried him back. That's when everybody in the family actually found out that he was suffering from diarrhea and he wasn't too well. But again, a very non-complaining personality. That's what we saw in Pramukh Swami Maharaj's nature. Very quiet, wouldn't weep, wouldn't mourn. Normally what would happen is you'd see children trying to gain attention. You could see a lack of this. He wasn't an attention-seeking child. From the beginning we could see this. And so these are some things that we see in the life of Pramukh Swami Maharaj. Again, a very quiet personality, spoke very, very little. And that's what we see in Pramukh Swami Maharaj's life. Jamma babat mato, you could see that, again, not very fussy about any food. Ke mare aa khau che, ke te khau che. Diwaliba would often say that whatever he was served, Shanti te jami leta tha. So he would, in fact, there were times he would have to be reminded ke tare jamwanu baki che. Another interesting fact, when he would go to school, what would they give him? So if the parents had prepared a lunchbox, normally what would he take? Puri and a debra. That's a standard lunch box that Pramukh Swami Maharaj would often take as a child when he went to school. Occasionally they would give him some pocket money. And when he was asked, did you use that pocket money? And he goes, hardly use that money. But whenever we did have that money, he would buy some jalebi. અને જલેબી લઈને શાસ્ત્રીજી પ્રમુખ સાંઈ મહારાજ તે વખતે થોડીક જલેબી પણ જમી લેતા અને he would share it with his friends. So it's very interesting to see or use the similarities within, people, kids growing over here as well. You'd get some pocket money. It's a very common thing that we would see. And this was the interesting thing about Pramukh Swami Maharaj. Just like a normal child, we see these things as well. Again, as we mentioned over here, as we mentioned earlier, nothing in particular ke mare aa khavu che te khavu che, but he would show a little bit of interest. If his mom had made puran puri, then this is something that Swami would show a slight desire to eat. Another interesting fact about Pramukh Swami Maharaj, we know that Swami na janma jayanti વખતે ઘણીવાર આપણે સાટા જલેબીની રસોઈ કરતા હોય છે. And jalebi is something that Swami would often pick at. Just થોડીક પ્રસાદીની ચપટી પણ Swami તે વખતે લેતા હતા. But nevertheless, these are some things, interesting facts. Another interesting fact about how, Diwaliba would often, when she was milking the cow, the fresh milk, she would offer it and give it to Shantilal. But Shantilal was not interested in drinking milk. But just to keep his mother happy, Swami would say, thodu te vakhate pee leto, so I would drink a little bit just to keep her happy. But another interesting fact about the life of Pramukh Swami Maharaj as a little child. He was so skinny, physically he was very, very thin. And so his friends, there was a friend of his name was Shankarlal, and Shankarlal would often jokingly call him Madiyu. Madiyu etle very skinny guy. And so that's another name that they would call Pramukh Swami Maharaj. But just as we can see, he wasn't very, very busy. But again, very sober, very, very quiet. Koi jatno agra koi babat no nahi. He wouldn't get angry or agitated very quickly. Again, Swami says, people say that he spoke very, very little. But whatever he did speak, it was very nice to listen to him speak. ઘણીવાર એવું કહે છે કે રૂપાની ઘંટડી જેવો એમનો અવાજ હતો. એટલે બહુ ગમે. Whenever Pramukh Swami Maharaj would speak or Shantilal would speak, people would actually enjoy listening to him speak. There was a sant by the name of Balkrishna Swami. He was an elderly sadhu, in the time of Shastriji Maharaj. But he would often say, and he narrated a very nice incident, that once the loft was being constructed in the old mandir in Chansad. And he said that I was also there with Shastriji Maharaj. And Motibhai, Pramukh Swami Maharaj's father, would often come and help us in the mandir over there. But he says, I remember seeing a young Shantilal at that time. And I still remember him uttering the sentence, Ke Bapuji ne hun bolau? Shall I call my father? Bapuji ne bolau? A very nice incident. And many, many decades later, Balkrishna Swami says, I still remember that voice. It still echoes in my mind. And that's how a strong print of Shastriji Maharaj's, a strong imprint was left in the mind of anybody who heard Shastriji, who heard Pramukh Swami Maharaj. It was also said that, he was just such a small, he was also say very, very little. Sometimes, okay, Pramukh Swami Maharaj bo ochu bolta. Sometimes you'd have to ask him a question 3-4 times before he'd actually reply. Ke haan, પણ એવું પણ સ્વામી ઓછું બોલતા. Another aspect that we read about in the life of Pramukh Swami Maharaj was એમના જીવનની અંદર તપ હતું. Performing renunciation and austerities. That's what the next chapter talks about. Despite his reservation in speaking, he didn't fail to speak up when needed. There was a time in Shantilal's childhood, because Motibhai had actually moved from Chansad to another village, a nearby village called Rajnagar, which was in the district of Sauli. And there was a Haribhakt by the name of Maganbhai, who was a very esteemed figure in that village. And so they were working on the farm nearby over there. And it said that Shantilal actually lived there for about 9 years. So they spent about 9 years in this village called Rajnagar. Another interesting fact. But within the village, growing up in that place, Shantilal also played a lot of games with the little Bardaks over there as well. There was a Haribhakt by the name of Chota Bhai from Bhadran. And he lived in a very large house in the same street as Shantilal, and had a lot of affection for all the children, because every time if he went out of town, whenever he came back, he would bring, special items to eat or some things to play for the children. Depending on the festival, sometimes Fuldolno festival hoy, so he would bring dates or popcorn or things like that. During the kite festival in Uttarayan, he would bring kites. During Diwali, he would bring fireworks for the little children to play with. But he had a special liking for Shantilal. And so this Chota Kaka, he would bring special toys for Shastriji Maharaj as well. There was one occasion when he prepared something special and made some food for all the children as well. And he wanted to throw a party for all the children. And so all the kids came to the village, to his house, and they were all eating. And they noticed that Pramukh Swami Maharaj, Shantilal, was very quiet in the corner, sitting there not eating anything. And so they approached him, and he approached him, he said, Swami, don't you want to eat? And he said, Shantilal, don't you want to eat anything? And Shantilal says, well, it's Ekadashi today, and I'm fasting, so I won't be able to eat. And so all the seniors sort of insisted a little bit, okay, look, you're still young, there's no need to observe Ekadashi right now, you don't need to do it, just go and enjoy it with the rest of the kids. But from his childhood, again, you can, even the parents had supported this initiative as well. So Shantilal was very strong and firm regarding this Ekadashi, and he stuck his ground. When people insisted even further, Shantilal started to tear up, and he started to cry. And that's when everybody backed off, and they realized how firm he was in this little. Otherwise, for a little child to be enticed with food like this would be very much easier. But again, Pramukh Swami Maharaj stood ground, and then eventually, everybody else went and got some farar items for him to eat. And that's another very nice story about Shantilal that we hear. One thing in this chapter that is very noteworthy is that Pramukh Swami Maharaj was also very, very tidy. He liked to keep things very clean. Swami would often say that from the beginning, we would like to keep everything in order at home. From a very young age, everything would be neat and clean. Even if a school bag was not kept properly in the place at school, even if something else was not kept properly, Swami would make sure he put everything straight. So very, very clean, very tidy. Another very interesting thing about Pramukh Swami Maharaj. The next chapter talks about how amicable he was. Again, we mentioned this earlier, a very amicable personality. Not only that, but he wouldn't like to argue or engage in any sort of dispute or any confrontation. And Swami had said once that from the beginning, I didn't like to argue with anyone, nor did I like to see others arguing. It would pain me, and I would wonder why people argued. Even if there was a reason for conflict, still, I wouldn't argue. I would merely tolerate. I would behave in such a way that the need for quarrel never arose. This reflects the personality of Pramukh Swami Maharaj. He could resolve other people's conflicts, but was never one to start a conflict. Not only that, it would disturb him to see any sort of conflict. And Swami goes, from early childhood, if I ever saw anyone fighting, I would keep a distance. Confrontation was never in my nature. In fact, I would become scared if others quarreled, sometimes even cry if I saw others fighting. I think this is something that we saw throughout the life of Pramukh Swami Maharaj. Pramukh Swami Maharaj's family background, I forgot to mention this earlier, but Pramukh Swami Maharaj had a total of 3 brothers and 6 sisters. However, 4 of them had passed away in their early childhood. 3 brothers, one was Dayabai and Nandubhai. The eldest was Purushottam Bhai, but he actually passed away much earlier. Again, sisters ma Kashi Ben, Kamla Ben, Chanchad Ben, Savita Ben, Ganga Ben, and Dahi Ben. Kashi Ben, but 3 of the sisters had actually passed away in their childhood. But of the siblings, there was one sister, Savita Ben, who had special love and affection for Shantilal. And people would often talk about this, that if all the children were gifted with sweets and things like that, she wouldn't eat it. She would hold it aside and make sure that she gave it to Shantilal. So another very nice prasang from the life of Shantilal. The next chapter talks about Pramukh Swami Maharaj's sympathetic nature. Just like other children in the village, normally what would happen was that Swami's routine was such that on Sundays or on holidays, Shantilal would go to the pastures on the banks of the river Vishwamitri to graze the livestock. And at home, they had 2 buffaloes and a pair of oxen. And normally what would happen would be after around 11 a.m., that's where they would actually have lunch. So after lunch at around 11 a.m., they would leave with all the friends, and it would take like about half an hour to reach the pastures. So they would take the oxen and the buffaloes to graze in the pastures. And the kids would then just leave the oxen or the animals to graze. In the afternoon, what the children would normally do is they would actually ride the buffalo, or they would ride the cows on the buffalo for fun. This is one thing that Pramukh Swami never did. Swami just felt that it wasn't something in his nature to ride on that buffalo or the cows at that time. In the afternoon, however, these cattle would, they would take a dip in the river, and all the boys would actually sit on the animals and cross the river. Pramukh Swami said that I would never sit on the animals. I would actually hold the tail and cross the river accordingly. So again, some interesting episodes from the life of Pramukh Swami Maharaj. But whenever he went to graze the cattle, Pramukh Swami Maharaj always made sure he took some books with him, and something he would say, while the cattle are grazing, and sometimes they would play, sometimes they would sit, and he would take some textbooks that he would read with him. Pramukh Swami Maharaj would often go, again, as I mentioned earlier, even when they were in Rajnagar, they would go there to graze the cattle. Moti Kaka's farm was pretty big. They had about 10 to 12 acres of land, which is 25 to 30 viga, 25 to 30 vigas. So about 10 to 12 acres of land. So Pramukh Swami Maharaj also helped his parents in farming. And normally what they would do is there would be a plow or a hoe on which Pramukh Swami Maharaj would sit. And that's how they would actually plow the fields at that time. The next chapter is about Pramukh Swami Maharaj's devotion and how very much disinterested he was. Even as a child, we could see these things in his life. They asked Pramukh Swami Maharaj once that, Tamari, what were your hobbies? What did you like as a child? And Swami would often say, that, Bhagwannu bhajan karvu ane karau. But many a time, Swami would actually enjoy doing bhajans and kirtans. And Swami would go from one mandir to another mandir with a group of friends. And they would go there to do bhajan, katha, kirtan. They would participate in all these things and also play musical instruments at that time. So Shantilal's house, for those of us who have been to Chansad, you'll probably remember that Shantilal's house was the first one on the road at the bottom of the hill. So that's the house where Shantilal used to stay, which was on the left-hand side of the sloping alley. In those days, so Pramukh Swami Maharaj would often talk about how sometimes in those days, when they were in, Swami had gone to Vadodara once, and there was a royal procession. So Swami had actually seen that royal procession at once. Normally, Pramukh Swami Maharaj's personality, he wasn't too interested in such things like this, but Swami did recount once and recollect how even in that time they had seen the Gaikwad's procession at that time. Generally, not much of a social, ekbijana ghare jau. However, he did go to Lachras, where his mother's village was. He'd been there about 5-6 times there. Shantilal also had been to Menpura. That was his grandmother's village. So Swami ek wakat ત્યાં પણ જયા છે. So again, interesting facts. One thing that I wanted to mention is Swami talked about his puja, how every morning Swami would do puja just like any child over here, any satsangi kids would do. But Swami mentioned that initially he didn't have his own puja. He would actually have to sit with his parents, and that's how he did his puja. But until then, he would sit with his parents. And then when he had his own personal puja, there was a sant by the name of Nana Akshar Swami, who was in Chansad. He gave Pramukh Swami Maharaj his first puja. And Pramukh Swami Maharaj would say that, in his puja, he normally had the murti of Shriji Maharaj, Gunatyanand Swami, and Shastriji Maharaj. And roj Swami Tilak Chandlo pan આવી રીતે રોજ કરતા હતા. Just like any other satsangi, Swami's niyam was very strong કે પૂજા કર્યા પછીથી જ સ્વામી કાંઈ પણ પાણી પીવાનું હોય કે એવું કોઈ પણ વસ્તુ કરવાનું હોય એ. Again, going to the mandir was also a normal thing. Regularly, Swami mandire jata, darshan karwa mate pan jata. He mentions that the first time he saw Shastriji Maharaj was in that village, in the village, Swaminarayan Mandir in the village over there. Normally what would happen was, so Swami ne આવી રીતે પણ શાસ્ત્રી મહારાજ દર્શન મંદિરે કર્યા. Mandir was like a second home for them. He would regularly, straight after school, they would go to the mandir for Sandhya Arti. In fact, his mother would even check up on him, કે શાંતિ મંદિરે આવ્યો તો કે નહીં. And the deal was this, that if you hadn't been to the mandir, then you have to miss a meal. Luckily for Shantilal, he never had to miss a meal. But again, mandire jaine, they would get together for Sandhya Arti, they would play the nagaru, just like little kids would run to the mandir, they would play the nagaru, jhalar vagade, all these kind of things as a childhood. We would see these traits in the life of in the life of Shantilal. The last chapter before we go into the Shayan Arti, it talks about how Shastriji Maharaj would love going for darshan and regularly go to the mandirs as well. Every time he would go to the mandir, Swami says that there was a time when mandir would become like a second home. Santo ave, santo ma kon avtu, to Mota Akshar Swami ave, Ghanshyam Swami, Bal Mukund Swami, all these people would visit. They were like their Mandar Sant, and this is when Shantilal would actually go there to do samagam of them. He learned many bhajans from them as well. Joi Murti, Manohar, Dayadu Prabhu, Akshar Purushottam. These are the bhajans that Bapa often remembers, that when he used to go to the mandir, these are the bhajans that they would sing, especially on Ekadashi. Swami also mentions how he had met Hari Bhaktas like Galbhai, Kalidas Bhai, Amtha Bhai, Mulji Bhai, all these senior Hari Bhaktas. He would mention that these are the Hari Bhaktas that I had met. He would also visit the Ranchodrai Mandir, which was nearby. ત્યાં મંદિરમાં જાય પછી સત્યનારાયણની મંદિર હતું, એમાં પણ પ્રમુખ સાંઈ મહારાજ હતા. અને હનુમાન ગઢી, these are the three main mandirs where Pramukh Swami Maharaj would often go as a child. That's where he learned how to blow the shank, the conch. મંદિરમાં જાય, સ્કૂલે જાય, and then they would blow the conch over there as well. He would also listen to the Ram Katha in the Ram Mandir, in the Hanuman Mandir over there, which was narrated by a Haridas Baba. That was the name of the Babaji that was in the Mandir over there. He would narrate that Katha. What was his, the topic, the chapter also narrates how Pramukh Swami Maharaj used to dress at that time. A very simple attire, cotton shirt and a dhoti. Sometimes he would wear a coat. And at school, mostly he would wear shorts, a pair of shorts going into school as well. His best friend was Shantilal. He was from a Ramanandi sect, and he lived directly opposite Pramukh Swami Maharaj. And normally, like kids would go to each other's houses to study. Same thing. Pramukh Swami Maharaj and his friends, they would hang out with each other. They would study. They would eat together as well. And they would go to each other's mandirs also. So these are some prasangs from the life of Pramukh Swami Maharaj. We will continue this in the next session. But until then, we will end today's session. Shri Swaminarayan Bhagavanani Jai.